Hello there. You probably thought we were done with you, but we are not yet. We've got one more piece of business, and it kind of gets right to the heart of why Post TV and The Fold are different than the evening newscast. We do not have to, well, we don't even get to play Jeopardy after the show. We can give you more stuff, and that's what we're doing this Friday by playing the full version of the Henry Kissinger interview I did earlier in the week. So if you're interested in that, it runs about 15 minutes. It'll play now, and in either case, have a fun weekend and hope to see you back here Monday. I'm going to let you kind of set the initial agenda. What do you see as the top challenge America will face in that next administration?
In the field of national security?
Yeah.
The immediate challenge we face is budgetary. That if all the cuts are implemented, then every expert that I know agrees that then our present commitments are very difficult to maintain.
The sequester cuts, you mean?
The sequester cuts. Even without the sequester cuts, our military budget is more constrained than it has been in a long time. But that's next year's problem. The more long-term problem is how to adjust our military strategy to our historical experience. We have now been engaged in 4 wars. Yeah. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, that we entered with great support and within a measurable time became extremely divisive. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan led to a total withdrawal of American forces.
And no clear victories in all 3.
And no clear victories in all 3. And even the outcome in Korea was was ambiguous. So we cannot continue a military strategy that gets us into these situations. When American forces are involved and Americans die, we have to achieve our objectives. And we then either have to alter our objectives or alter our strategy. One of the lessons I draw from the experience is that a long, extended ground war that has no definable end except endurance can be conducted only for the most major American objectives, and that we have to think of a strategy which is less focused on extended ground wars and more focused on peripheral actions in which we can inflict damage on our adversary, but don't try to come to an ultimate resolution of its overall capabilities.
So if our top challenge is fiscal, at least in the short term, how do you balance that giant deficit and our security needs? And do you support some significant reductions in military spending?
No, we first have to define what our elemental security needs are. Those have to be funded, whatever the fiscal strain.
Even if it bankrupts the country?
Well, if it bankrupts the country, then it threatens one of our most elemental aspects of security. But in fundamentally, national security should be given the highest priority, defined in terms. Of course, we have to keep the fiscal considerations in mind, but we have first to define what our elemental security needs are. Those have to be financed.
So even in this very difficult situation, you don't think we should go cutting military spending in any significant way?
No, I'm not saying we shouldn't cut military spending.
Are you saying we should?
I don't think we should, no. Yeah. I'm saying we should not begin by saying cutting spending is the principal objective. we should reduce unnecessary spending, which means we should adjust our strategic reach to what we consider is essential, but we should not cut beyond that.
We all saw Benjamin Netanyahu get up at the UN a week ago and draw that red line on his marker board. Should the U.S. join Israel in drawing a red line on Iran's nuclear ambitions?
There are two ways to look at red lines. One is, should we make a public announcement that can be used by Israel or any country as a justification for its going to war? That we cannot do. We cannot subcontract the right to go to war. That is an American decision, to go to war for ourselves.
So, just so I understand, so you're saying we should not draw a public red line because of that?
First thing is, we should not draw a red line that another country can invoke
right.
in order to go to war with its own forces.
Right.
Now, we do need to define for ourselves when we say that nuclear weapons are unacceptable, a nuclear weapons capability is unacceptable. We need to know for ourselves what we mean by that. What is the definition of a nuclear weapons capability? Now, should we announce that? If the issue is extremely complicated, then it's probably unwise to announce it because it will lead itself to controversy. But within the administration, it is absolutely necessary that such a concept exists. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but that's one kind of red line.
But Dr. Kissinger's advice is private red line, publicly don't say it.
I would say private red line, publicly decided in terms of tactical necessity.
Yeah. And right now it's not necessary?
Not how we define nuclear weapons capability, because that's still a partially controversial subject. Thirdly, however, it is also important that the other side understands that there is a minimum red line, which, if crossed, has certain consequences. And when you say something is unacceptable, that means that if breached, something will happen. What that something is, how it should be done, that need not be advertised, but it has to remain unacceptable to the other side.
Is there something we should be doing in Syria that we're not doing?
I've written an article for you.
For our esteemed publication.
For your publication.
WashingtonPost.com. You can find a number of your past.
And in which I indicated that the use of American ground forces and overt military action in Syria is not, in my view, advisable.
For the point you made before, that you can't fight a ground war unless you're going to win it.
Yes, and because there's no clear extrication, and because creating a political structure in Syria will prove to be at least as complicated as it was in Iraq. At the same time, since it now seems to be apparent that Iran has introduced covert forces there, it is in our interest that the Iranian influence in Syria be eliminated, if at all possible. And so I would support CIA-type activities to help the resistance groups.
We're going to skip around the world a little bit because our time here isn't limitless. You've been interacting face-to-face with the Chinese for over 4 decades. They're growing and becoming more powerful economically and otherwise to an extent they never have before. Do you see any shift? Do you feel any concern about them becoming more assertive? We've seen it in the South China Sea. We've seen it in a number of different spheres.
The Chinese are bound to become more powerful because that's inherent in a growing economy. it's all and therefore the impact of a growing country on an established country has always been one of the big problems of international diplomacy. Based on 40 years' experience of dealing with the Chinese, I do not believe that we are at a point where a confrontation with China is the best American strategy, and we should attempt to the greatest extent possible, and so must they, to see whether we can avoid what in Europe led to World War I, when at the end of that war, none of the countries that were involved would have ended it had they known what the consequences would be.
And yet we see candidate after candidate get up there and bludgeon China as a way to win votes.
I've answered that question once. I'll never answer it again.
Before we came on, Dr. Kissinger admitted that he went a little further than you wished you had.
Than I wished I had.
Yeah, so I won't ask you to do that again. But I want to ask one more on China, though, because it just stands to reason that when it's 1978 and your country's economy is in shambles, and even through the 80s as they were growing and reforming, of course you can't be expansionistic. It's all they can do just to keep what's within China under control. But when you look forward, it's hard not to think that anyone that had the power that China likely will have in 20, 30 years would use it in a more assertive way.
Well, assertive isn't the same as expansionist. In a globalized economy, it is inevitable that a country that grows, whose economy grows, will have a growing influence on other countries. Our duty or our responsibility is to make sure that our economy remains vital and that we can offer a significant competition to these efforts under those conditions. I believe that since both sides stand to lose so much from a confrontational course, that they owe it to themselves to attempt to do something that's not been done before in history. Normally, expansionist countries and established countries clashed, and maybe that will happen again. But it should not be. It should not happen because we did not seek the alternative. But we cannot do it alone. The Chinese have to do their part.
Two more questions. Mitt Romney called Russia the U.S.'s number one geopolitical foe.
I won't get into any campaign type questions.
So you don't agree, or you do agree?
I'm not going to get into that question.
Okay, well, let me ask you not a policy question. Do you think there's an important choice for voters in this election between the two candidates on national security and foreign policy?
Well, I've endorsed Governor Romney,
right.
But I also think that foreign policy should be as nonpartisan as possible. And so I state my views on issues. I state my basic endorsement, but I don't want to be involved in the day-to-day campaigning.
Fair enough. The premise of our segment is there's too much who's up, who's down, looking at polls. No one ever talks policy. And I think voters want to know, who should I vote for and why? And so I wonder if you have an argument for why there's even an important difference between the two in these matters.
I'm endorsing Governor Romney. And I've issued a statement at the time together with other secretaries of state because we think he would conduct a responsible foreign policy. And I won't go beyond that.
Okay, and we won't go beyond that either. Thank you so much, Dr. Kissinger. We really appreciate it.
Nice to see you.